I want to understand one thing. Only 28 countries in Africa out of 54, probably 55 countries. Those are the only country with data protections laws in place, or they're working on this particular data protections laws in place in Africa. So I want to understand from his perspective, why do you think most of African countries, they don't see this data protection as one of the important things to implement to their countries, so that at least data of their citizens and so on can be well protected? Why do you think there is a problem they don't really want to go along with this?
Thank you for that question, Yusuf. So I'll start off by pointing out that there is a convention, the Cybersecurity and Personal Data Convention of the African Union, that talks about measures that should be put in place to protect data. And this convention has been agreed upon by the members of the African Union. So by writ large, the African countries have agreed to it. So there is that in place. So at the worst case scenario, with these countries lacking particular data protection specific laws, there is an overarching convention at the African Union level that protects data protection, that protects data. Now, I think the other aspect of it is that there is privacy is considered to be a human rights a human right. And basically, this is something that has been implemented at the UN level as well. So it means that it is considered to be a human right. Now, the challenge we have in Africa, I believe, is that we're still trying to catch up with basic elements of development, that we see data protection as a technology question, as something that is IT related, that does not specifically expect a country to be able to comply with. So it means that African countries basically have bigger challenges in their view, rather than promoting data privacy, which they see as a human right that is far-fetched, that is on the frontier, that is at the border of their countries, rather than something that is integral to their well-being, such as healthcare, such as infrastructure, road infrastructure, such as child education, and basically elections. Because when you look at it, Yusuf, we're still even trying to manage our elections properly, right? So we haven't gotten to the point where we are comfortable as citizens. We haven't reached a social contract as citizens of Africa to say, listen, data privacy is an element of compliance that we need to have in place, because it is seen to be something that is a Western mechanism. Now, the good thing, though, is that the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU has placed such restrictions, and it is considered to be, because when you look at the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU, which was adopted and became affirmed in 2016, and it became active in 2016, they have a requirement that you're liable for up to 5% of annual turnover of your company. So basically, your company's profits are tied to whether or not you are compliant with data protection regulation. So now it has placed it has been such a hit, and it has been so popular that other countries are now taking notice and are realizing that this is something that we need to have as countries. So the popularity and the fact that the popularity of the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU is also one where you see that the Facebooks of the world, the Googles and the Microsofts and the Twitters are very observant of it. For example, if you look at Facebook recently had an update to their WhatsApp policy, and they basically said that if you are a WhatsApp policy user, then you need to accept that your data will be shared with Facebook, because Facebook acquired WhatsApp several years ago. Now, what happened was they did not send that notice to EU citizens, because the EU has a general data protection regulation. They sent that to African countries, to countries within Latin America, and to countries within the USA, because the USA does not have a comprehensive data protection law. So the popularity of the general data protection regulation has meant that companies and organizations in far-off countries like Kenya take notice and say, listen, we need to have strong data protection regulations. And as a result of that, regulators and politicians are beginning to take notice. So it is no big thing, it is no small thing that you have 28 countries in Africa with some form of data protection law. It is no small thing.
Yeah, but now, how, if you ask to advise these leaders of different countries, that how will you advise them to, how are you going to convince them so that at least they can see these things is quite important and they need to take it into action and they need to implement it because it's for their own good?
Well, I would give them this sort of advice. I would say, listen, one way to look at it is to look at it in terms of dollars and cents. And if you are a country, if you're any regulator, if you're looking at ways in which you can be able to bring in revenue. The data protection regulations can be sources of revenue. When you look at the EU, for example, the EU has issued, EU countries have issued various fines that companies have had to comply with. So for example, British Airways has had to be fined, and Facebook, for example, has a specific kitty within the company to be able to comply with fines that they expect to get from the general data protection regulation. So it can be a source of income, it can be a source of revenue for the particular countries. The other thing, though, is to point out that it is widely accepted to be a basic human right. Data privacy is a basic human right, and that's something that has been written into the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, and it is something that has been agreed upon by African countries at the African Union level. So as a fundamental human right, it needs to be implemented to make sure that individuals within the particular countries are compliant with the fundamental human right.
So how can we support countries like, for example, South Sudan, which is struggling on ICT itself? What I want to say, they are struggling, still they're struggling to get somewhere. But how now a country like this, a small one, a very young nation within African continent, and still struggling in many ways, how can we support countries like this to achieve this kind of objective?
Well, I would say that you need to talk about data privacy and data protection as being a central part of development. Because when you look at the fact that development is now couched into technology terms, that development is part of technology and technology is part of development, and that, for example, the penetration of mobile phones, for example, within Africa is significant, and that it is important to make sure that that technology is appropriately used, because the data privacy can actually even come to terms with questions around government use of force and government use of technology, because it protects individuals' rights against infringement by both the government and as well as the companies. So I think that the way to couch it for countries like South Sudan is by talking about the fact that it is part of the advancement in technology, and technology means economic empowerment. And if economic empowerment is something that any country seeks to have, then it becomes important to have data privacy alongside technological development.
Okay, thank you. But the last thing I want, you as a data protection expert, do you think this is the story of data privacy, the awareness part of it? Do you think the work has been done properly in African countries?
I don't think it has been done well enough, because—
And what do you think should be added so that at least you can reach somewhere as an expert in data protection?
I think it hasn't been done well enough because we are still having these, and there was a slide I had in which I talked about false dichotomies between data privacy by design and data security. And I can also point out that there's a false dichotomy between development as a country and data privacy or data protection. So there is a false dichotomy which basically says that in order for us to deal with data protection or data privacy, we need to reach this level of economic development. The point I'm trying to make is that it is important to have both by side, economic development alongside the development in data privacy and data protection. So number one, we have to acknowledge it as a fundamental human right. Is it in the Constitution? So for example, Kenya has data privacy as a constitutional right. So the question is, in Europe, when you go to Europe, the Europeans have data protection as a fundamental human right. Data privacy is a fundamental human right. So is it part of the Constitution? Is it part of the Constitution? Now, part of how you can also be able to couch this data privacy and data protection to make sure that you're supporting these countries well is you look at the history of the countries that have been strong in implementing data protection, and those countries are in the EU. And when you look at the reasons why the EU is particularly strong on data protection and data privacy, it goes back to the times of the Nazi era. It goes to the times of fascism, where government was using unchecked powers to monitor individuals, to harass individuals of particular ethnic descent, and being able to monitor them on an unregulated basis. So when you look at the history of EU, of the EU data protection regulations, it can give you a clue and tell you that we can have the same thing here in Africa, because we've seen in Africa that data can be misused by governments, and that governments, when you're in the opposition, it can actually harass you, or it can be able to cause you harm. So I think part of it is talking to them, talking to Africans about the history of EU regulations, and pointing out that there are similarities between what happened in the EU in the Nazi era and the fascism era, and what is happening in Africa, what's happened in Africa most recently, and then talk about how they can be able to overcome the data privacy challenge.
Thank you, thank you. I think the time is not on our side, and yes. I wanted to understand this because I think we have a big journey ahead of us to convince these leaders across African countries to be able to see these things as one of the very important things, and so that they can be able to implement in their respective countries. And I think it's a little bit difficult for all of us to get somewhere with it. That's why I wanted it to at least to hear from us, so that at least we can be able to understand and see how we can be able to wisely advise our leaders basically on this particular area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yusuf, for your questions.